All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm trying to figure out where to stand relative to the projector. My name is Lisa Doy, and we're also joined, and Rob Buscher really put this session together. But we're going to talk today about resettlement and the resettlement experience for Japanese Americans. I'm going to go first, then Rob, and then we want to make sure we save some time for Q&A. But there are a few announce or like kind of shout outs I want to give before I get into the bulk of what I'm going to talk about. The first is I'm going to talk about resettlement to Chicago. I know there are actually many people in this audience who grew up in Chicago, so I really appreciate all of you for coming and sort of maybe you'll see some of yourself reflected in this. I also want to plug, I think we've got a few postcards roaming around. So there's a Crystal City Pilgrimage postcard that's floating around. And then if you're interested afterwards, Kat, who I'm going to plug in the back, who's helping with the AV and recording, put out some, the Japanese American Service Committee in Chicago has 2 digital exhibits about Japanese Americans in Chicago. So you can learn more about these here. And Kat also, when she used to live in Chicago, worked on a story for our local NPR station about resettlement to Chicago, and I hear it's going to be on PRI this week, Public Radio International. So it's a rebroadcast of the original story. So if you search like Japanese American I think the official story was called "What Happened to Chicago's Japanese American Community." But I honestly think if you search Japanese American resettlement to Chicago or Japanese Americans in Chicago, WBEZ, which is our NPR station, you'll find it. It's a really great story that Kat put together, and it's how we met many years ago. So I just wanted to plug her and some of the resources she has here. So this is now sort of older research that I did about Japanese American resettlement to Chicago. So I'm going to first talk about sort of the broader policy of dispersal resettlement by the War Relocation Authority, and then talk a little bit about the specifics of Japanese Americans in Chicago. As I looked at the history of Japanese American incarceration, I think one of the outcomes, both intentional and somewhat unintentional, of the incarceration process was the dispersal of Japanese Americans across the country and the dissolution of pre-war ethnic enclaves. In his memoir, WRA director Dylan Meyer wrote, "The most important result of the WRA program was the relocation of more than 50,000 Japanese Americans all across the United States. This dispersion of the population led to an understanding and acceptance on the part of the great American public that would never have been possible otherwise." I think Chicago is an exemplary case study for this, as nearly 20,000 Japanese Americans, or 1 in 5 people, spent some period of time in Chicago, starting from a pre-war population of about 300. So, as many of you know, the Japanese Americans were removed from their West Coast home, placed into interior detention sites across the United States, managed by the WRA. But the WRA, I think in many ways, found the management of the daily lives of this many people very challenging, and so they were looking for many ways to get people out. This started with college students, but by the end of 1942, early 1943, the WRA, along with the Army, created the so-called loyalty questionnaire to develop a process for leave clearance to determine, quote unquote, loyal Japanese Americans who could be released. They could not return to the US West Coast, but they could go to other parts of the United States. And at the time of, contemporaneous to World War II, Dylan Meyer wrote that this would solve a serious racial problem by having Japanese Americans scattered throughout the United States instead of bunched up into 3 or 4 states on the West Coast. This focus on dispersal resettlement was informed by contemporary social science ideology and the idea of assimilation and sort of what assimilation would look like. While social scientists of the day, understood that Japanese Americans were not racially white, they did feel that Japanese Americans could be assimilated into white communities, particularly sort of through the dispersal and the dissolution of ethnic enclaves. And it wasn't just social scientists. Eleanor Roosevelt wrote an article in Collier's magazine where she said, "We should never have allowed any groups to settle and create little German, Japanese, or Scandinavian islands and not melt into the general community pattern." So she encouraged, quote, taxpayers in California or Maine, it is to your advantage if you find one or two Japanese American families settled in your neighborhood to try to regard them as individuals and not condemn them before they are given a fair chance to prove themselves in the community. Again, sort of drawing on Dylan Meyer, he says, in a curious way, the dispersal resettlement, by taking small isolated groups of Japanese from the West Coast and spreading them across the American landscape, would fit perfectly into the assimilation cycle and would resolve a, quote, Oriental problem. So to do this, the WRA sort of created these offices across the country to encourage Nisei to resettle. And one of the other resources that helps us understand Chicago really well is that Dorothy Swain Thomas, who did her Japanese American evacuation and resettlement study, chose Chicago as one of her resettlement sites. And she found that the group, so in my sort of broader research, I look a little bit at like the demographics of who chose to resettle to Chicago. And generally, broadly, they sort of model the broader Japanese American community, but there are some demographic differences that I think mark this community. Thomas found that the Japanese Americans in Chicago were more open to assimilation. They were more likely to identify as Nisei. They were more likely to have grown up in cities. They were more likely to be Christian than Buddhist, and they were less likely to have traveled to or received education in Japan. But at the same time, Japanese Americans in Chicago still faced racial discrimination and segregation. And so I'm gonna get to sort of the bulk of the research that I've done is looking at where Japanese Americans lived in Chicago. I realize I should have, in case you're not familiar with Chicago, provided just a more general map of what Chicago looks like. But I'm gonna focus on two neighborhoods in Chicago. This neighborhood is called the Near North Side. This is the Chicago River. This right here below the map is downtown Chicago. And if you've heard of Naomi Hirahara's book, Clark and Division, Clark and Division, the street intersection is like right at the center of this map. So this is one of the two neighborhoods that Japanese Americans resettled in immediately after World War II, and I'm just gonna skip ahead and show you the other major neighborhood that Japanese Americans resettled in, which is the south side of Chicago. So this is sort of right in the middle of this map is a neighborhood called Hyde Park, where the University of Chicago is, sort of accompanied by Kenwood, Oakland on the north side of Hyde Park, and Woodlawn on the south side of Hyde Park. So as I was interested in looking at where Japanese Americans moved in Chicago and then how they moved through the city over the decades, I also was interested in what the racial demographics of Chicago looked like. And ultimately what I argued through my research is that Japanese Americans initially settled in communities that were sort of on the cusp of integration by Black Americans. So they were sort of in this neighborhoods that were in between Black and white Chicago. And Chicago in 1940 was largely a Black and white city. There was a very small Asian American community, mostly Chinese American, and there was a very small Latino community at that time. So Black and white Chicagoans were really sort of who was making up the city at that time. So through sort of this mapping of where Japanese Americans lived, I can see that Japanese Americans are sort of living in these in-between neighborhoods. Dorothy Swain Thomas's research, she interviewed landlords as well who talked about this sort of being on the cusp of neighborhoods changing racially and preferring to rent to Japanese American tenants over Black tenants when given the option. But then I also, as I look at Japanese Americans over time, see movement of Japanese Americans out of these neighborhoods as they become increasingly Black. And broadly, Japanese Americans are moving further and further north in Chicago and eventually out into the suburbs, particularly the suburbs on the north and northwest sides of Chicago. So I'm just gonna sort of flow through some maps. So in these maps, which come from census data, red dots represent white Chicago population, blue dots represent Black Chicago population, and I think you'll see some purple dots, and those represent Asian Americans in Chicago. And then I'll talk you through the next set of maps. So this is the Near North Side in 1940, mostly white, but you do see a sort of little pocket, I think I can do this here, little pocket of a Black community starting to form. And this is the population of Japanese Americans in the same neighborhood in the early mid 1940s. So you see a big cluster of Japanese Americans, again, right around Clark and Division. And then overlaid, you see, I think in the Japanese American population, this sort of line here where you have more Japanese Americans on the east side of the near north side than on the west side. So sort of overlaid with the broader racial demographics, you can see it here. Over the 50s and 60s, the Black population in the near north side grows largely through the construction of Cabrini Green, which was one of the largest public housing projects in America. Eventually became a very infamous public housing project that was, I think, like blown up maybe on TV in the 90s or late 80s. And so as public housing changes as well, public housing in the 1940s is serving returning white veterans. By the 50s and especially by the 60s, it is serving mostly low-income Black communities. You see this sort of boom in the Black population in this neighborhood. And so again, in the mid-1950s, this is sort of the Japanese American population in the same neighborhood. Those two communities overlaid. 1960, even greater density of Black Chicagoans in this neighborhood. Now you start to see a decrease in the Japanese American community in the same neighborhood. And I think that's gonna be it. So here, by this time, for the community that's living here, not pictured in this map, they're starting to move further and further north into neighborhoods like Lakeview, Uptown, Edgewater, which are the neighborhoods further north of this than on the map. So here's the south side, and again, blue is the Black community, red is the white community on the south side. You see this like really stark racial divide between the two communities. There is like a, very explicit housing covenants that are enforcing racial segregation on the south side of Chicago. Those break in 1947. So this is census data from 1940. Within the next 7 years, there's gonna be a big movement, and you'll see this in the maps, of Black Chicagoans from sort of the west side of the south side towards the lake. So this is the largest population of Japanese Americans in Chicago in the early 1940s. This is where many Japanese Americans start as families move to the south side, particularly the northern part of the south side initially, in neighborhoods like Oakland and Kenwood. The neighborhood of Hyde Park, which is kind of the middle of this map, has always been a slightly wealthier neighborhood because of its proximity to the University of Chicago and sort of relationship with the University of Chicago. So Japanese Americans are living sort of a little bit outside of that area specifically. But if you overlay these two, you see that within this like strict racial divide, Japanese Americans are living really decidedly on sort of the white side of this breakdown. But as I mentioned, after 1947, this barrier begins to break. So by 1950, you see more Black Chicagoans are moving to the east side. This is Japanese American community population. And by 1960, you see just tremendous white flight out of the south side broadly. And at the same time, you see that Japanese American population has really dwindled on the south side. So it goes from being like the #1 community where Japanese Americans are living to, again, really having lost its Japanese American community. And I think one other way to visualize this is a friend of mine, Ross Hirano, who grew up on the south side. These are his school photos. So this is Ross in kindergarten in a very racially diverse classroom. And Ross was in camp, so this is probably the late 40s, early 50s, probably late 40s for kindergarten. You see he's in a very racially diverse classroom with Black students, white students, other Asian American students. Again, Ross in 8th grade, this is his 8th grade graduation photo. His class is getting increasingly Black. And then Ross as prom king, his senior year of high school, where he is the only Japanese American student left in his high school, in a school that is mostly Black, but Black and white, sort of somewhat racially mixed high school. And I just want to conclude by saying, I have looked most closely at the Japanese American community in Chicago, but as I've given this talk in Japanese American communities all around the country, this is not a unique story. This story, I think, plays out in many Japanese American communities. Certainly in LA, I think you could say very similar things about the Japanese American community, particularly in San Francisco, and the relationship or proximity to neighborhoods like the Fillmore. But I think in many Japanese American cities, you see this sort of similar progression of living in these racially mixed or proximate neighborhoods. And then over the course of the 1950s, 1960s, an increased movement of Japanese Americans into increasingly white urban neighborhoods, as well as increasingly white suburban neighborhoods. So I think Chicago serves as just one case study or one example, but in a pattern that you can see replicated in cities across the country. And with that, I'm gonna hand it to Rob.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, so I realized in the book this was just titled Resettlement. This is resettlement outside of the West Coast, in case folks are wondering why we're not talking more about California. But again, this is changing perspectives, so we want to talk about the things that don't often get covered. So as Lisa talked about Chicago and the Midwest, I'm going to be talking about resettlement on the East Coast. And give me just a second to get my slides up here. So one of the things that maybe we can kind of delve into when we do the Q&A is the experience of growing up on the East Coast and the Midwest as multiracial Japanese Americans, because we're there as an extension of the post-war resettlement, and those experiences are pretty unique compared to, I think, what most people here in the West Coast have experienced and do experience in community. But in this context, I'm going to be talking about some of my research on post-war resettlement. I'm based in Philadelphia. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania at the Asian American Studies program. And a lot of my research, since I've moved there in 2010, has been sort of devoted to trying to understand why are there so many Japanese Americans in Philly? And it doesn't seem like a lot, because it's not. But I grew up in rural suburban Connecticut, where my mom and sister were the only other Japanese Americans in my community. So by comparison, the under 3,000 Nikkei who live in the greater Philadelphia area is an enormous community and is actually one of the larger on the East Coast, and one of the historically visible and significant in terms of both advocacy as well as the larger sort of post-war narrative of who Japanese Americans become, both in good ways and bad ways. So this presentation is kind of split into two sections. I'm going to be talking about some of the process of resettlement, the actual logistics that people use to come to the East Coast, some of the unique contexts that people were settled into. And then the second part, I'm going to be introducing some of the incredible community organizers and leaders who grew out of this experience of resettlement on the East Coast in ways that are pretty unique to the circumstances that they found themselves in. So this is older data now, but this is from the 2010 census. And what you can see here is the population of ethnically Japanese folks in the United States. That's of any generation, including post-war immigrants and their descendants. It includes multiracial Japanese Americans. So being that this data is 15 years old now, obviously it's not the most accurate, but it gives you a picture, at least in a snapshot, of what our population looks like across states. So no surprises, right? The West Coast is the most populous, as well as Hawaii. But we do have these pockets of people. And so some of this can be accounted for in terms of the larger population states, right? And so like per capita, the demographics in a large population state like Texas, even though it's not a bastion of Japanese American culture, is going to be slightly larger than some of these other states in rural parts of the country where some of the incarceration camps were located. But yeah, you'll notice Pennsylvania's like 12,000, New York State about 50,000, and smaller pockets here and there. The DC metro area around the District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia has a pocket of people. And all of those can more or less trace themselves to the resettlement if they're multi-generational Japanese Americans, keeping in mind that there are Japanese businesses that have opened over the last 60 years or so and have brought in a significant population of both temporary worker residents from Japan as well as people who resettled here permanently and started families and now have shin nisei, shin sansei folks that are part of our communities, as they are here on the West Coast. But generally speaking, after the incarceration, right, things were pretty dire, and there were a lot of people who lost everything. Few people had property to return to. Those who were lucky enough to have arrived before the alien land law may have had property, but in those cases, some of it was confiscated by the government, depending where it was. Many people were never compensated despite the redress. So in the immediate resettlement era that Lisa started to talk about, we see this sort of dispersal, right? And people are leaving camp early, first on temporary leave clearance, and then after the loyalty questionnaire, those who are quote unquote loyal are deemed eligible for permanent leave as long as they resettle outside of Military Area 1 on the West Coast. So folks who resettle outside of the exclusion zone are going to major population centers, Chicago obviously being the largest, but Philadelphia, New York City, Boston, DC, and then some of the smaller cities in the Midwest, Cincinnati, Cleveland, St. Louis, the Twin Cities. So we have these little pockets, right, that are as early as, like late 1943, and we start to see more people coming in 44, and certainly by the end of the war. But ultimately, a lot of these folks do end up returning to the West Coast, right? So once the state of California reopens its borders, once the exclusion area is canceled by the military order, a lot of people do elect to eventually return to the West Coast. But again, some people had nothing to return to. The image that I'm showing on the bottom right hand is the Winona trailer camp in Los Angeles. Many people are living in trailer park conditions. Obviously, a lot of hostility to Japanese Americans that exist throughout the country, this one from the Seattle area. One of the big stories about resettlement that I found when I started researching Philadelphia was the story of the Quakers, right? And I think we all anecdotally know that Quakers were good allies to us, but I wanted to try to understand like what it is exactly. How did they arrange for people to be helped? The American Friends Service Committee, which is the official advocacy branch of the Quaker faith, they were one of the few vocal critics of the Executive Order 9066 and the forced removal and mass incarceration of our communities. And they continued throughout the war to actively lobby for that to end, as well as trying to find ways to make the conditions better in camp. A lot of Quakers volunteered to join the WRA administration to try to improve conditions. Some people who were educators moved to these rural relocation centers, the concentration camps, to teach the schools and hopefully influence better standard of education and living. And then eventually, they petitioned the government to create a couple of important institutions, the first of which is the Japanese American Student Relocation Council. And so this was based in Philadelphia, because the Quakers are based in Philadelphia. And it was actually across the street from the War Relocation Authority regional office in Philly. And both the director of the WRA office in Philly and the president of the Japanese American Student Relocation Council were Quakers. So they began this campaign in 1942, actually, to try to get Nisei college-age students out of camp. And they were able to place students in some of the Philadelphia area Quaker institutions because John Nason, who was the leader of the Student Relocation Council, was also president of Swarthmore College, a historically Quaker institution. They also worked together with Bryn Mawr Institute, which at the time was a all-women's school, but also a Quaker institution, and then later began getting people into the Friends schools, which are their middle school, high school. And once they were able to get the students out of camp, they could make the argument for the parents to join them eventually. And so even as adult-aged college students, they eventually begin this sort of chain migration of moving whole families into the Philadelphia region and into other areas throughout the East Coast, and similarly in the Midwest. So this is a really significant allyship, right? It's a great roadmap of like what could potentially be done in a lot of different contexts. And we do see some similar notes being taken around the resettlement of Southeast Asian refugees in the post-Vietnam era. I'll just note that there's actually a memorial fund, the Nisei Student Relocation Commemorative Fund, that was established by the beneficiaries, Nisei students who had received the help from the Quakers, then pooled their resources in 1980 to create a scholarship fund for Southeast Asian refugees and their descendants to have similar help in coming to universities and paying their tuitions. So the scope of this is not insignificant. It's about 4,000 Nisei college students that are resettled at about 600 participating schools throughout the United States. But this does also play into the sort of dispersal resettlement, right? So you have these little pockets of people where there might be a dozen or fewer Nisei at a college institution that has 10 or 20,000 people at it. So it is putting these little pockets of people sort of on an island without any context or community. One of the other institutions, which I referenced, are the WRA regional offices. So the WRA headquarters is in Washington, D.C. They have regional offices in Philadelphia, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut. They begin resettling people sort of throughout the East Coast in those close quarters. And there's a couple different ways that they're supporting people. Once they were able to get the permanent leave clearance, in some cases, in the earlier part of the war, they required like an economic guarantor employer who was going to give them like some kind of guaranteed labor. But that changes, right? And towards the end of 1943, early 1944, we start to see more resettlement that is coming in through the WRA regional offices. They have posted boards that have job offers. They've got maps that show where the housing is available to them. And it's a pretty large enterprise, which again is being operated, at least in Philadelphia, by Quakers and later Japanese Americans. So in these regional offices, we see a lot of folks who are able to kind of get that first step out of camp. We see a population that is sort of in flux because people don't necessarily stay where they initially resettle. The housing conditions weren't great in many of these places. You have to remember what the housing stock was like in Philadelphia in the 1940s. They still had windowless tenement apartments made out of wood, right? These places that people are getting sick because there's no like air circulation or sunshine. These were not great environments to live in, but it certainly was better than living behind barbed wire. So this was the first step that a lot of people are taking out of camp. So it's hard to get accurate numbers in terms of where people permanently stayed. We know that at least 7,000 people were processed through the WRA office in Philadelphia, but the number of Japanese Americans at its peak in Philadelphia is about 7,000, shrinks down to about 3,000 once California reopens its borders. We also have the individuals that were resettled at Seabrook Farms, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit, who were processed through that regional office, but then lived in South Jersey in a rural area that was farmlands. And let's talk a little bit about Philadelphia and the hostels. So in a lot of these resettlement cities, they had temporary hostels that were basically halfway houses, right? They were kind of like these places where individuals, and in some cases families, would go to stay for a couple days to a couple weeks. Pretty much just a temporary housing solution while they found more permanent housing. And so each of them are a little bit different. The Philadelphia Hostel is actually the longest operated, and this was also an institution that was established by Quakers. But this was operating basically until the 1960s. After the Japanese American resettlement, they began housing international students, including some like Shin Issei rather, who came from Japan in the post-war. But this is the Inoue family who operated the hostel, Saburo and Michiko, and their children who were students at Swarthmore College. So they were beneficiaries of the Japanese American Student Relocation Council. The parents were then allowed to join them in Pennsylvania. And after living in the hostel for a couple weeks, the Quakers actually made them the administrators of the hostel, and that was their job basically until Saburo passed away. One of the other interesting things, the location of the hostel was in a historically black neighborhood called the Black Bottom. So this historic neighborhood dates back to the founding of the nation. It was one of the largest middle-class black neighborhoods with a high percentage of home ownership. So we're talking about middle class, upper middle class homeowners, multi-generational residents of these neighborhoods. And unfortunately, the neighborhood becomes gentrified and is then essentially razed in order to make room for the expansion of University of Pennsylvania and Drexel University, what they now call University City in the 1950s. So what's kind of unique about this, the Philadelphia Hostel was located around where, just around the perimeter here, like 33rd and Chestnut Street, in this historically black neighborhood. So a lot of the first friends and neighbors and allies that people were introduced to in the Philadelphia resettlement were the black community. And these, in some cases, result in long-lasting, lifelong friendships that also turn into organizing partnerships And we start to see in the civil rights era, which I'll be talking about shortly, some of these relationships actually create tremendous opportunities for cross-community organizing and solidarity, both within the context of Black civil rights and later in the context of the redress movement. But this is a group called the Dewey Wright Gospel Choir, local West Philadelphia Baptist church, and they used to give weekly concerts to the residents of the hostel. So broader view on sort of East Coast hostels. Again, these are sort of temporary housing. We can see by the numbers here, there's a lot of people that are passing through here, but it's pretty short. The average stay was usually around a week at a time, sometimes as few as 2 to 3 days, depending on what the situation was and how many housing units were available to people. Most of them are pretty small, capacity of around 25 people. So it's really just because of the volume and the rapid turnover in the residents that they're able to accommodate as many as they did. But these were important lifelines for people. So one of the sort of interesting things, there was pushback on hostels in some of these locations, both in the context of the New York, the Manhattan one, as well as the Pittsburgh one. Philadelphia didn't experience that. There was only one complaint letter to the government, and the local community actually kind of came together and supported this. So I think the unique situation of Philadelphia being a largely Quaker city, that even for people who were not practicing Quakers, the mentality and the sort of psyche of Philadelphia was one that was conducive to the resettlement. And then certainly being in a predominantly Black neighborhood, I think there were a lot of people who understood the context of institutional white supremacy. So these are some of the images of the Philadelphia resettlement. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the WRA photography section, wraps. They want to keep it under wraps, but these were propaganda photos that they used to basically show the peaceful resettlement of Japanese Americans returning to civilian life after World War II. Look how great they look. It's like JAGQ, they're just kind of strolling down and having their nice picnic lunch by the Schuylkill banks. It gives you a very different picture, right? It's like, oh, it wasn't so bad. They're not traumatized. They're just back in normal life. But in reality, again, these are the living conditions that they're in. This is the Harada family. They were resettled in an area that's actually right now quite nice, near Rittenhouse Square. But in the time, in the 1940s, it was an impoverished working class Irish Catholic neighborhood. And the Haradas were living in, again, this sort of, late 1800s tenement building made out of wood, very drafty, prone to rodents and insects. But it was the best that they could do in the city that they were living in. The Haradas ended up attending the local Catholic school and converting to Catholicism to try to sort of fit in more so to the local population. This is the Michiko Inoue with her grandson in the back area of the Philadelphia hostel. But again, by comparison, you have these sort of photographs. Interesting to note, these photos were all taken by a Nisei photographer, Karl Iwasaki. The late Lane Hirabayashi wrote about him in his book on the WRA photography section. And I have to wonder, as a Nisei, did Iwasaki think he was sort of doing a favor to the community? Was he maybe more of the assimilationist JACL viewpoint of that era? Or was he just trying to smooth the path for people to resettle? In any case, you can see how posed and perfect each one of these people are, but it does give you a sense of the diversity of the sort of professions that people found themselves in, between doctors and nurses, beauticians, grocery people, mechanics at the Philadelphia Taxi Company, Shojiro Horikawa at the Philadelphia Print Shop, and George Kaneda at the Hotel Whittier as a chef. So it's pretty diverse. The other thing about Philadelphia, it wasn't a single location that people found housing in. So the city, pretty expansive. They couldn't afford much, so they're in mostly impoverished areas. But you had sort of smatterings of people all over South Philadelphia, which is a historic immigrant neighborhood, largely Italian and Irish at that time period, but also Eastern European Jews. West Philadelphia, which was predominantly Black, and Northeast Philadelphia, which had sort of Eastern European immigrants as well. You also have some urban or suburban and rural resettlers. So this is George Nakashima, the famed Nisei woodworker. He resettled in New Hope, Pennsylvania, about a 30-minute drive north of the city. He and his family were able to get out of camp early because Antonín Raymond, the Czech-American architect, he worked with him in Tokyo during the pre-war era as an architect, and he was able to sponsor the family to get out of camp. So, people have these kinds of interesting stories, and then Nakashima ends up becoming this very prominent woodworker, fabulous mid-century furniture designer. And his daughter, Mira, who's pictured here, is now the person who operates that studio since he passed. The JACLs were very significant in resettlement, as Lisa touched on yesterday briefly in the panel. A lot of people don't realize this is all that there is. Right? So whatever the politics of JACL are, if we didn't belong to our chapters, then we would not have a Japanese American community. So it's also kind of interesting because being that this is the only Japanese American organization, you'll have resistors and no-nos hanging out with veterans of the 442. And that's the community that I grew up in. And when we did go to the New York JACL chapter events, and when I first moved to Philadelphia and more of the old timers were still around. But these are some of the photos from early JACL picnics and other events. The person on the left-hand side, it's a little dim, but that's Tak Moriyuchi. He's a Nisei Quaker farmer. He resettled in Moorestown, New Jersey, and became, at the time, the owner of the largest apple orchard in the state of New Jersey, about 300 acres. He was able to buy his first 30 from a Quaker farmer that hired him out of camp. And then he began hiring other Nisei resettlers to come and work on his farm. So he became a very successful, prominent farmer in the community, and was actually someone who helped to finance a lot of redress work that JACL was doing. But these became interesting opportunities for people to practice culture as well. So on his apple farm, they would have ohanami. Instead of the cherry blossoms, it would be the apple blossoms. And these were the ways that Japanese Americans continued to practice our culture. In Seabrook Farms, which I kind of mentioned as well, I'm going to try to speed up here because I know we're running short on time. Seabrook was the largest single employer of Japanese American resettlers. And so what we see here, it was a packing, shipping plant for frozen vegetables. Bird's Eye, Bluebird, some of the brands that they used to distribute. And all told, about 2,500 Japanese Americans, as well as several hundred Japanese Latin Americans, including some of the Japanese Peruvians that we were just talking about in the last panel. The housing was provided. It wasn't great. Some of it were very similar to the wooden barracks of camp. Others were these sort of concrete block houses. But again, certainly better than the conditions that people were used to living in. If you make it to Bridgeton, New Jersey, where the former Seabrook used to be, they have a small exhibit of resettlement-made art. So the same way that people made camp art, there are a number of the painters and other craftspeople who created art of what Hoover Village and the other housing of Seabrook looked like. One of the unique things about Seabrook, it's the only Jodo Shinshu Buddhist temple in the tri-state region of New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania. To this day, still hosts Obon. On a good year, we can get 300 or 400 people. People kind of use it as a reunion, almost like a camp reunion. So by 1950s, Japanese Americans have found their footing. And to a large extent, the strategy of resettlement that Lisa was talking about, dispersal, it worked. Many Japanese Americans assimilated into the broader white communities. People were living in suburban areas by that time period. And while they still faced discrimination in certain areas, they were able to have a certain proximity to whiteness that allowed them and afforded them certain opportunities that their black and brown neighbors did not enjoy in the city of Philadelphia. If you'd like to learn more about some of the resettlement, JCL Philadelphia did a virtual exhibition during the pandemic called The Third Space, Japanese American Resettlement in Greater Philadelphia. Website's still active. And I just want to very quickly introduce a couple of these figures before we get into the Q&A. So Judge Maritani, some of you might recognize as the only Japanese American member of the Commission of Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians. So he was one of the people presiding over the redress hearings. And he came to Philadelphia in 1953 to accept a job offer with McCoy Evans Law Office after graduating from the law school at the University of Chicago. He was a pretty significant person both in the community, locally. I mean, he was longtime JACLer, but was also very active on a national scale. In 1963, he joined the JACL delegation at the March on Washington and marched alongside Dr. King and the many advocates for Black civil rights. In 1967, he delivered an amicus brief in support of the Loving family in Loving versus Virginia, which ends up striking down the anti-miscegenation laws. And he even did some pro bono work around voter restrictions in the Deep South. He spent several years volunteering his legal hours to try to get people out of jail on trumped-up charges. Another is Mas Nakawatase. Mas was born in Poston and then grew up in Seabrook Farms. In 1963, he dropped out of college at Rutgers, took a Greyhound bus, one-way ticket to Atlanta, showed up on the doorstep of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, asked them for a job, and then spent the next 2 years doing hate crime reporting in the Jim Crow South. So Moss then eventually comes back to the North. He does labor organizing, union organizing in rural New Jersey, where he grew up, and then became a longtime staff member of the American Friends Service Committee, where he was the official representative, their liaison to the American Indian movement for about 25 years. Of course, I'm sure people know Yuri Kochiyama. So Yuri, from the Jerome camp in Arkansas, she meets her future husband, Bill Kochiyama, he was actually born and raised in New York City and Manhattan. So they get engaged and then married. She returns to New York with him after the war, and they end up in Section 8 housing, living in Harlem. Some of the only non-Black peoples living in public housing in Harlem at that time period, and became deeply enmeshed in the struggle for Black liberation. She became close friends and organizing partners with Malcolm X. These photos were taken from an event that she hosted at her apartment in Harlem, where she had several hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, who spoke about their ordeals. Malcolm came and heard them speak, and this was the quote that he had to say: "You've been scarred by the atom bomb. You see that we've also been scarred. The bomb that hit us was racism." These are the kinds of stories that you can only get from the context of these resettlements. Kiyoshi Kuromiya, much younger person, he was born at Heart Mountain. He didn't come to the East Coast until he was 18, when he started college at the University of Pennsylvania. But Kiyoshi was one of the leading activists in the Gay Liberation Front. He co-founded that in Philadelphia after the Stonewall riots in New York City, one of the first gay rights movements in modern history. Kiyoshi was deeply involved in the anti-Vietnam War protests, and before that, he actually spent time in the Deep South, also advocating for Black civil rights. So this is him standing with Dr. King and Reverend Abernathy at a press conference after he was badly beaten by an Alabama sheriff's posse. He was putting himself between the sheriff's posse and Black high school students to make sure that they weren't able to cause harm. When Dr. King found out what had happened, he was so moved that this young Japanese American put his body on the line. He came to Alabama to represent him personally. A couple others, Grace Uehara. Grace was a really significant figure within the redress. She was a really incredible force of nature who, as an organizer, kind of brought up the Philadelphia community to sort of the national level within the JACL at least. But her family resettled early out of camp, and so she spent her early career years as a social worker in Philadelphia before joining the school district in, I think, Lower Merion. But Grace, she went on to serve as the executive director of the Legislative Education Committee, which led JACL's lobbying efforts during the redress movement. And she did a lot of fundraising too. The JACL Legacy Fund grant exists because of the work that Grace did. Reiko Nakawatase Gasper, actually the older sister of Mas Nakawatase, grew up in Seabrook, slightly older than him. But she was, after high school, became a West Philadelphia resident and became deeply involved with the local Black organizing efforts during civil rights. And as an educator, She created curriculum that served many different audiences, but brought in Japanese culture and other aspects. She was involved in an organization called Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. So JACL is sort of doing the civil rights organizing. Friends of the Japanese House and Garden have more of a cultural diplomacy lens. And together, they created the first East Coast Japanese American exhibit called the Japanese American Experience. It took place in 1985 at the Buscher Institute for Ethnic Studies in Philadelphia. One of the things that I'll try kind of coming to the close here to think about when the Japan bashing era began, US-Japan trade war, it affected all of our communities, but I think particularly in regions of the country where there were less of us. And I think particularly on the East Coast, because there were some very high-profile business acquisitions that took place in New York City, it was especially pronounced in the region. So, on the sort of tail end of this, 1989, we have the sale of CBS radio to Sony, Japanese corporation. Mitsubishi also brought a majority share in Rockefeller Center. So two of these very iconic American brands being turned over to Japanese ownership stirs up quite a bit of anti-Japanese racism. And unfortunately, that sort of necessitates the work of orgs like JACL and also in Philadelphia, the Friends of the Japanese House and Garden. So in Philadelphia, we actually have a Japanese house and garden that was built in the post-war era as a friendly diplomacy act between the government of Japan, United States. It was first built in 1954 for an exhibit at MoMA. So this is in Midtown Manhattan. After 2 years, the exhibit closed and the Rockefeller Foundation paid for it to be relocated to Philadelphia, the former site of the Centennial Exposition, where there was the very first Japanese presence at an international exposition in 1876. And we see the image of what that looked like at the Centennial, and then this is Shofuso being built. But for Japanese Americans in our greater Philadelphia region, it really became a hub of cultural organizing. And by this time, the Nisei were in their later years, and they sort of realized, as assimilated as they had become, they missed their Japanese culture, and they worried that their Sansei children weren't going to have enough of that. So they began thinking very intently about cultural maintenance and how to pass forward to the next generation the important aspects of our Japanese culture that their Issei parents had given to them. So Mary Watanabe is the last of the community leaders that I'll introduce. She was the first Nisei to graduate from Radcliffe College, Harvard's women's college, in the 1940s. And first resettled in Boston and was active in the New England JACL chapter before coming to Philadelphia in 1953. But she was the one who really led this charge in this organization. So this is an image of Hodaiko, the local taiko troupe associated with Seabrook Buddhist Temple, performing at Obon in Philadelphia outside of the Shofuso Japanese House and Garden. So as you can see, a lot of unique stories that come out of the resettlement. Our community may be small, but it is sort of intertwined across each of these regions. The shared affiliations between the JCL local chapters as well as the few Buddhist churches that are available to us lend itself to the larger sharing of culture on the East Coast. If you'd like to learn more specifically about the last bit that I was talking about, you can visit this website. There was a exhibit about the role that cultural organizing played within the Japanese American movement in Greater Philadelphia. So that's it. Thank you. So I guess, we've got maybe 10 minutes for questions. I think I see someone in the back.
And I think we're going to run the mic.
Yeah.
I think if there's another one as well. Do the question.
I was just wondering, when people resettled, how much the type of work or occupations they had before, they went to camp, were they able to, find work in what they previously did, or do you know? I guess our family were farmers and gardeners and, like West LA and that area. So I just had never really thought about that, so I'm curious.
Yeah, I'll say from the Dorothy Swain Thomas's research with the JURS study, finding jobs was one of the easiest things that Japanese Americans experienced during resettlement. There was a major labor shortage because of the war, and so Japanese Americans were very easily able to find employment in Chicago. I'm sure that's true on the East Coast as well. Housing was much harder, but I do think what you're saying, as Rob mentioned, with Seabrook, farmers who want to continue farming would maybe go to a place like Seabrook in the Chicago area, the broader Midwest. There were a lot of farm jobs that people could have, and farm labor was very much needed during World War II. So Japanese Americans were definitely able to find jobs in different cities. I think the more professional fields would probably be where Japanese Americans faced the most discrimination, but they had, Japanese Americans in professions like medicine and higher education were also experiencing discrimination before World War II as well. So I think over the course of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, they saw a lot more advancement in those kinds of fields.
I'll just add, because not related to the East Coast, but most of my family left California during the so-called voluntary evacuation and wound up in the Salt Lake City suburbs in Ogden. My great-grandparents went from owning a successful farm business that they had operated for about 15 years in Torrance-Gardena area to being sharecroppers for the rest of their lives. My great-grandmother was a domestic helper and servant, and she cooked for wealthy white people throughout the rest of her life. So it kind of varies, right, based on like where people were, what kind of opportunities were available to them.
I have a question. My parents were married in the camps in Amachi. Then they moved to Chicago. I wish I had asked my parents this earlier, but would they already have jobs? And they also lived in I guess it was a boarding house with all Japanese Americans. And I was able to go back before my mother passed to visit one of her friends that she had met during that time.
Yeah, wonderful that you got to go back. As I think Rob mentioned this, but at the very beginning of the leave clearance process, Japanese Americans had to have a job prior to leaving camp. But that didn't last very long. Pretty quickly, the WRA decided they most wanted people to get out, and then they could help them find jobs in the cities they went to. And so it sort of depends on when your parents left camp. A lot of people had jobs before they left, but the requirement to have a job was relaxed by the WRA.
Hi, I was curious about why so many Japanese ended up at Seabrook. And I just read that there's a new biography out about the Seabrook family.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Basically, there were labor shortages, but there were also labor disputes. So Seabrook Farms was the site of a major labor union organizing effort in the 1930s that was pretty violently put down by law enforcement. And the Klan were even involved in trying to break up labor unions, and they continued to be involved in South Jersey well through the 60s, doing similar union busting. So what ends up happening, you have kind of two perspectives on Seabrook. In one sense, the Seabrook farms provided an opportunity that Japanese Americans weren't getting elsewhere at that time period. Their housing was provided to them. They had decently paying jobs. They weren't great paying, but they had a place to live and work, and it was outside of the barbed wire camps. In one sense, the Seabrook family did their effort to try to smooth the path for resettlement. So for about a month before the first Japanese Americans arrived, Charles Seabrook paid his employees only in silver dollars. And the reason why is that as cash registers throughout South Jersey filled with silver dollars, he reminded people who held the purse strings. And so basically he was saying, don't mess with the Japanese Americans because they're my workers. So you could look at that from the perspective of here's someone who's doing something that's altruistic, but at the same time, he's filling a labor shortage. There's long hours. It is lower wages than what they may have received elsewhere, and certainly before the war. And then at the same time, you have this really interesting satellite community that I would say is probably the closest thing to like a rural Japantown. It has the feel of a Nihonmachi. Now it's very sparsely populated. There's like 22 Japanese Americans in the entire county. But at a time, when there were still several thousand, we had like Nisei basketball, volleyball, baseball. We have, the temple there and the Minyo dancers, the Hodaiko. So there's a lot of cultural practice. There's a lot of history, and the community continues to be visible, even though they're quite small.
Hi, thank you. Back here. I found out that my grandfather got a job through the WRA as a relocation counselor in Kansas City. And I'm wondering if you have any recommendations or places to start for research on that program, or, how he got that job or what that entailed, or, any more information about that. Thank you.
Yeah, the WRA has a lot of records in Washington, D.C. All the regional offices kept records. Unfortunately, you'll have to go to the National Archives to access them. But I think in particular, if he worked there, it seems likely that he was the one writing those kinds of reports on what resettlement would look like. So that would be my biggest recommendation on sources. In terms of what his job might have entailed, they had regional offices across the country, and people who would help newly arrived Japanese Americans find jobs, find housing. Many of these offices ran or had affiliated sort of like social organizations. They might be run by a Quaker, community, or a other Christian community that would, host dinners, as Rob showed, had, music and other kinds of entertainment available for newly arriving Japanese Americans. So those might be some of the things that your grandfather would have worked on. But Rob, do you have any other thoughts on sources?
It's hard to find this kind of content because it hasn't been well researched. And I think that if anything, it's an opportunity to maybe do some research and possibly publish on it if you're interested. But I think the sources that Lisa mentioned are probably the best bet.
Okay. Rob, you had mentioned that in many of these areas there were, JCL was the only organization around. There were a lot of Kenjinkai, prefectural organizations on the West Coast. Did any of that get imported, and particularly like maybe in places like Chicago where there were more people?
Yeah, so Lisa can talk on the Chicago element. I could tell you in the East Coast, we didn't have a large enough population to have those kinds of prefectural associations. We did have Fujinkai, like the Women's Buddhist Association. So that continued in some contexts. And I forgot to mention in Philadelphia, we also had the Japanese Christian Church. So for Issei, primarily, who were Christian, they had a Japanese language church service that began in 1944 and continues till today, actually, because there's a number of Shin Issei who have come from Japan in recent years that are Christian and prefer to go to worship in Japanese. So aside from that, I'm not sure if you have any more on Chicago.
Yeah, so just maybe picking up on what Rob said. In Chicago, there were 2 Jodo Shinshu Buddhist temples, 5 Japanese American Christian churches that all still exist to this day. I think the best example of a Kenjinkai, though, is Colorado. And this actually started before the war, but because there wasn't sort of enough of a population from different ken, they had what they call the Colorado Nikkei Jinkai, so a pan-Japan equivalent organization. So I'm not, sorry, I don't know specifically about Chicago, but I do think there's some evidence that when you lack sort of having the ken-specific groups, you can make the sort of broader Japanese American organization.
I was just going to mention too, one of the other things, because we have more business or had historically more business entities on the East Coast that were coming from Japan, a number of the sort of Nichibei Kyokai, the Japan America societies, are established, and Japan Society in New York City being the largest and most visible, founded basically by the Rockefellers in the post-war era who had business interests in Japan. So again, not entirely altruistic. They're trying to smooth over the relations so that they can continue to wealth in themselves. But in the process, they do create some opportunities for cultural diplomacy, like Shofuso and like other Japanese folk events that were happening in New York City, Washington, D.C. The Rockefellers were involved in the Smithsonian Folklife Festival. It took place in 1976 as a funder, which had a heavy presence of Japanese Americans, largely from Seabrook, but including some who came from the West, including my Hiba-chan, who came from Utah to participate. But yeah, the Japan America societies sort of present another opportunity now on the East Coast, particularly maybe the West Coast or Midwest, for sort of blending the multi-generational Mikke, Sansei, Yonsei with some of the Shin-Ise, Shin-Nisei. That's certainly been happening in our region as we have Sansei, Yonsei practitioners of traditional arts like the Chado or some of the Minyo dancers who are then working together with these newer immigrants from Japan to continue the preservation and practice of our culture.
I remember you saying that Japanese Americans were encouraged to scatter across the United States for resettlement, and perhaps like Chicago was like a more unique situation. But I'm curious about why they were encouraged to disperse, not necessarily have a high concentration in a certain area. And like kind of like my guesses, or a speculation that I have is, are there any like underlying tones of limiting or diluting a concentration of Japanese Americans, for one, like limiting organizing power, and perhaps like limiting an echo chamber of like anti-government sentiments?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say those reasons are not stated. I would say these stated reasons are, I think social scientists of the era would say that assimilation is the goal for immigrants. In the first half, probably beyond that, of the 20th century, like the goal is to get European immigrants, is where this starts from, assimilated, Americanized, change their names, stop speaking their native language, start cooking American food. And so sociologists are sort of like trying to apply the same kind of idea to Japanese Americans. And one way that they really see that this can happen is if you physically spread out Japanese Americans. So I think it was Dylan Meyer who wrote the ideal distribution of Japanese Americans would be 1 to 2 families in every county across America. So they were like really like trying to disperse people. That's not what they achieved, but that's what they were trying to do. It looks like Susan's gonna.
So the WRA put out pamphlets that they were given to, especially the Nisei teenagers that were going to Chicago and places for jobs. And the pamphlets said, it had guidelines that they wanted them to adhere to. And so one of the guidelines was not be conspicuous, and to limit your associations to just 1 or 2 other Nisei. So this was a pamphlet that they gave them about how to fit in.
Yeah.
Don't speak Japanese.
Don't speak. Oh, there was a list. Yeah.
And so while I don't think they were explicit in saying like this will, disperse political power, et cetera, there were these sort of.
But it was this tone
Yes.
of we want you to be,
Yes.
keep a low profile and.
Yes. And I think the other thing I would add to that is, so, I think my data shows that Japanese Americans in Chicago and many cities outside the West Coast did end up living together. And this was sort of against the desires of the WRA. And so why did this happen? And I think the reality, and in the WRA's sort of like reports, particularly on Chicago, they kind of acknowledge that like as much as they're trying to get Japanese Americans not to associate with each other, like that's not possible. Japanese Americans are facing discrimination from non-Japanese Americans that is causing them to have to live together because they can't find housing elsewhere. It's causing them to form social organizations because, as Rob was saying, like if you want to go to church service but you don't speak English, you need to go to a Japanese language church service. And so the WRA fairly quickly sort of concedes that they're not going to be as successful as they want in assimilating Japanese Americans very rapidly, and doesn't actively stop Japanese Americans in Chicago from forming these residential neighborhoods.
And I think it was also a function of the WRA trying to keep the policymakers in Washington, D.C., this is what we're doing, we're giving them these pamphlets, while there is also the reality that was on the ground.
I think one of the things, too, that I've discovered in my research on the later years of the Nisei on the East Coast is that they really did see this cultural practice as resistance, right? Like cultural maintenance, cultural practice, continuity in our Japanese-ness was part of their resistance to those policies. And they may not have felt safe enough to do that in the first decades after resettlement, but by the time that they were approaching the end of their lives, they realized that this was what was most important about preserving this community.
I also know that we're a little over time, so maybe this can be the last question.
Can you speak to how Hollywood affected helped the Japanese American assimilate into, society, the 50s and 60s.
In terms of the, sort of post-war, like re-civilianization in Hollywood cinema and like positive propaganda? Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So, starting with the 442, we have the Office of War Information that are releasing these newsreels, which are basically propaganda. But the Rescue of the Lost Battalion is a really substantial piece that gets nationwide recognition, and people are looking at this story. And then the subsequent pieces that show like President Truman giving their presidential citation during a victory parade in Washington, D.C., as these images of the sort of triumphant Nisei who have paid their blood tax and are now accepted into the Legion of America. And that's continued then by like the Go for Broke film that came out in, I think, 1950. Was it Van Johnson? Yeah. So it's like they have that effort, but I think it's interesting too because there were so many anti-Japanese propaganda pieces against the Japanese, and they did some limited efforts to ameliorate that. So like another example would be Shirley Yamaguchi stars in Japanese War Bride, like a 1952 film, I believe, and that was about a Japanese war bride who marries an American GI and comes to the United States, and sort of dramatization of what that experience was and the challenges that she faced. There was also a documentary newsreel that was also titled Japanese War Bride that came out from the Office of War Information, US military, to try to get the American people to accept that there were going to be Japanese people living in these sort of rural, white suburban areas, rural areas. But I think, for the most part, there continues to be sort of, we get to eventually the model minority myth, right? Like 1966, we have the Japanese American success story article, William Peterson. And that is like deeply damaging, right? In some ways, because what it does is sort of create this false narrative that Japanese Americans have pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, and 2 decades since the end of World War II, suddenly everything's fixed, and their Nisei kids are doctors and lawyers, and they're living the American dream, and totally ignoring all of the trauma and all of the financial, economic loss, the unrealized dreams that happened, especially among the Issei. So there's this sort of damaging narratives, but it also then allows like the further integration of Japanese Americans into the broader society. So, I mean, we could get much further into the weeds, but I think that's as short as I could answer that one.
Just to add quickly, and then we'll let you go to lunch. I think one of my big questions was like, how do you get from the 1940s to, as Rob just mentioned, 1966 and success story Japanese American style, and Japanese American sort of being the first model minority. And to me, I think one of the key things that is also happening at the same time is the GI Bill and the way that that is like radically reshaping America. And that Japanese American veterans are able to access the GI Bill in ways that Black veterans are not able to because of racial, systemic racism. So Japanese American veterans are able to get college educations. Japanese American veterans are able to get subsidized home mortgages and move into the suburbs, and just able to sort of access economic growth that happens within a lot of mostly white America in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And so I think it's not Hollywood, but I think that helps to shift the public narrative of Japanese America drastically.
And actually, I did think of one other, James Shigeta becomes a very popular actor in the late 50s, and handsome young man who is on the silver screen starring opposite of white women, like a friendlier version of Sashi Hayakawa. And most of those stories still end in tragedy, but they're not due to anything that he's done as a villain. There's still some aspect of the sort of cautionary tale. I'm thinking of Bridge to the Sun, which is based on a true story of an American woman who was married to an Issei man who was a diplomat, and the whole family moved to Japan during the wartime. And by the end of the film, he dies and the family is separated. But yeah, I mean, there's interesting opportunities to kind of reframe and reshape what it means to have like the Japanese American body on screen in contrast to the Japanese. And that is a conscious effort, I think, by Hollywood to try to reclaim what that is, but more so to the effort of eventually assimilating Japanese Americans.
Yeah, thank you.